Hello and welcome to this first session in what's going to be 5 posts, videos, live sessions that I'm going to do on how to manage the taxes of your self-employment, whether that's you being in business for yourself or being an independent contractor. There are a lot of things that go into that, and there are a lot of things that can affect your taxes. I'm trying to boil it down here to 5 basic concepts that you need to understand as a self-employed person, and that's going to include independent contractors, if you're getting a 1099, if you started a business yourself. If you're in this situation where you're not a W-2 employee, then these key concepts are going to be critical for you to understand why your business is set up the way it is from a legal and a tax perspective, how that's going to affect your finances and the way you interact with your business, and also thinking about how you need to handle the day-to-day, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter, year-to-year affairs of your business. So let's get right into today's topic. So again, this is the first of 5. There's going to be one of these every weekday this week: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Today is the first day. We're going to start with the very basics, and today we're going to talk about the legal entity. And the legal entity is the core of your business from both a legal and a financial perspective. How you decide to initiate that business as a separate legal entity is going to have implications for everything else that follows that we're going to talk about this week. So this is the first step. This is the first key concept to understanding self-employment, being in business for yourself. And that's going to be the legal entity that you set up. I'm going to move my situation over here just a little bit so I can see the comments, the discussion going on a little bit better. If you're just joining in and you've got questions about anything that comes up, please feel free to ask those questions as a comment. I'm perfectly happy to clarify some things or address some questions if you've got them, whatever comes up. But first of all, legal entities. What do we mean by this? So usually, and by usually I mean 99% of the time, your legal entity is registered at the state level. The legal entity of your business exists at the state level. What we're going to talk about tomorrow is stuff that happens at the federal level. But for now, today, when it comes to the legal entity, we're talking about state level. So Florida, California, New York, Arizona, Illinois, whatever state you're in is where you're going to go to register the legal entity that is your business. Usually this is done through the Secretary of State's office. And so just about every state has a department within its executive branch called the Secretary of State, and usually that office is where all of the records are held for corporations, where all of those business filings happen. In fact, for those states that have a Secretary of State's office, which is where you register the entity, a lot of the annual filing is going to be submitted to the Secretary of State's office. This tends to cause problems for a lot of self-employed people who are trying to do it themselves, because you'll often wind up to where you need to maintain records for your business in 2 different places. So for example, those of you in California, you have to file and pay what's called the franchise tax to the California Franchise Tax Board, FTB. The FTB in California is what's responsible for taking in most of the tax revenue of the state. It's like the IRS, but for California. But then there's also a separate filing called the annual statement that has to be filed with the Secretary of State's office. Now, this is 2 separate filings. Usually people do the first one to FTB, they forget about the Secretary of State's office. That usually ends up being late, which is an automatic $250 penalty for those of you with businesses registered in California if you don't get that annual filing with the Secretary of State's office in on time. So you got to be careful with these things. Usually the entity is registered with the Secretary of State's office, but that might not be the only requirement. There might be other requirements for your entity as well. So again, this is going to vary state to state. In Florida, which is where I'm at currently, you register your business through a division of the Secretary of State's office called the Division of Corporations, which gets a little confusing when we talk about what these legal entities actually are here in a minute, because there are other types besides corporations, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So you're going to go to your state level. You're going to figure out where you need to register your entity within your state. Again, this is usually within the Secretary of State's office or some division therein. You're going to register the business. So what are you actually going to register? Almost universally, regardless of which state you're in. And some states change the names a little bit. They add a couple different kinds that really are immaterial for this discussion. Pretty much what we have right now across all the states in the US is 3 basic types of legal entity. And pretty much all the states call these things roughly the same thing. The first one is the LLC, the Limited Liability Company. This has become one of the most common legal entities that you can register because it tends to be fairly easy. LLCs have become so popular and so dominant within this legal entity space that most people just want an LLC for a couple different reasons. One, they tend to be relatively easy to set up. Usually what you'll have is the articles of formation or articles of organization, which for most states is about a 3 or 4 page document. And really most of that is just fluff. It could probably be condensed even more, but really what you've got is a couple pages worth of information. And some of it gets redundant depending on the size of your business. So most of my clients that I work with, they have very simple operations. It's usually just an individual that needs some sort of legal entity for their independent contractor business that they're doing, or they're self-employed and they just want to stay themselves. And so it usually ends up being a fairly simple filing where it's the business's name, what's called the registered agent. The registered agent is the person that's responsible for accepting correspondence on behalf of that entity. 9 times out of 10 with my clients, the owner is the registered agent. If some official piece of mail is going to come to your business, you just want it to come to the owner. Sometimes you might want a layer of anonymity, or you might have a business situation where you would want to put a neutral third party between the entity and those officials that are sending correspondence to it. And so you might contract with a registered agent service. And these are usually companies that are set up and led by attorneys or have attorneys on staff that can act as not necessarily a legal counsel, but can act in that role as registered agent and accept correspondence on behalf of the business. They can also give the owner a little bit of anonymity, but not really much, because you also have to put what's called the members of the LLC are. So every LLC has to have at least 1 member. Member is just another word for owner when it comes to LLC. These are the people that actually own the business. Now, a lot of times you'll have what's called a managing member. This is an owner that's also responsible for the day-to-day operations of the LLC. So within an LLC, in terms of the people actually responsible for what's going on, you can have 3 different individuals. You have the member, who's an owner, you have a manager who runs the day-to-day operations, and then you can have a managing member, which is a combination of those 2 things. Again, 99% of the time with my clients, it's a managing member. It's one person that both owns the business and is responsible for the day-to-day operations. LLCs need what's called an operating agreement. And again, this is constant across pretty much all the states. This is usually a somewhat formal document that lays out who is responsible for what in terms of the leadership of the business. Again, most of the time you have 1 individual. Therefore, it's pretty simple. Whoever that individual is owns the business, runs the business, makes all the decisions for the business. If you get a more complex situation where you have more owners, then this operating agreement becomes more important, because there are things like, how are we going to distribute the profits of the business? Who owns what? even though all of these managing members are responsible for the day-to-day operations, what are their specific roles within the business? What if there's disagreement among those managing members? Right? Who gets to decide? Who has power within, and how much power within the business? What happens if there's a disagreement among them? Do we have a vote? What happens if one of the members wants to liquidate his part of that business and leave the business? How are we going to handle these kinds of situations? What happens if all of the members say they want to shut the business down? Right? How do we go through that process? How do we divide up the assets among the members, the owners? And so these things need to be spelled out in a document. Now, again, 9 times out of 10, my clients are the only person. So this doesn't need to be a very complex document. It's less than a page, right? Because whatever that person says goes. And so it doesn't have to be a lot of extra work, but it is something that needs to be there. And some states are going to be absolutely insistent upon it. This depends on the state, but what's universal is that this business needs an operating agreement. Some states are going to differ from others in terms of how stringently they enforce that. But it's really something that in a small operation, it's not very difficult to come up with. More complex operation with multiple owners, you might want to get a business attorney involved in this. With an LLC, you need at least one owner. That one person owned LLC, or what we call a single member LLC, is effectively treated like a sole proprietorship. We'll get more into that tomorrow when it comes to tax structures for these legal entities. But today we're only looking at legal entity types. When you have more than one member, though, we have what's called a multi-member LLC. This will default to a partnership. Again, more on that tomorrow. So that's LLCs in a nutshell. The most common type, the most common type, when you see a business name that ends in LLC, that's what it means. Limited liability company. It essentially means that whoever owns that business has registered it with the state as an LLC. The second type of entity is a partnership. And here we have 2 kinds, general and limited. Now, if you've got more than one individual going into this, then you may want to register a partnership. At least one of those partners needs to be a general partner, though. And this is true of whether it's a general partnership or a limited partnership. The general partner is the person responsible ultimately for representing that partnership. Somebody's got to be in charge. We got to be able to go to somebody. But you can have that limited liability as well with a partnership. A partnership needs a partnership agreement. Now, this needs to be stressed a little bit more than the operating agreement with an LLC was, because with a partnership, you automatically have more than one person running it. So you have the possibility for conflict. You have the possibility for a partner wanting to leave. You have the possibility for partners wanting to shut down the business, maybe against the wishes of other partners. And so you need to have clear rules in place in writing for what's going to happen in these situations, for how decisions are going to get made, for what the responsibilities of those different partners within the partnership is. Now, on the other hand, a partnership is really flexible in terms of distributing ownership and profits and losses. And notice I say ownership, profits, and losses, because with a partnership, those are 3 different things. With other business types, they're usually the same thing. However much you own of the business usually dictates how much of the profits or the losses of that business you're responsible for. With a partnership, these are 3 different things. You can own a certain slice of the business, but then you can take more than or less than that slice of the profits and more or less than that slice of the losses. This is the conversation of why you might want to do this is way beyond what we're talking about here today. But this is something that if you were looking to form a partnership, you would want to talk about with a business attorney, with the other partners, and with an accountant. And this is a conversation that you'd want to have and make sure that, again, these things are clearly spelled out in the partnership agreement. Partnerships are becoming less and less common, registered partnerships, because back to LLCs. If you have more than one member of an LLC, then it's automatically treated as if it was a partnership. LLCs are easier to form, they're easier to create in general. And so most business attorneys, accountants, and owners are going to opt toward the LLC as a simpler way of creating what eventually will become a partnership. And so you're not seeing as many of these, except for some cases, which I'll talk about toward the end. So LLCs, partnerships, and the third legal entity type is a corporation. When you see a business name that ends in INC, Inc., this is a corporation that's been registered at the state level as a corporation. So in general, most of the time, right, you tend to see business names that are either XYZ LLC or XYZ Inc. This reflects the dominance that the LLC and the corporation forms, legal entities have in terms of registered businesses. And even then you tend to see a lot more LLCs than Incs anymore. One of the reasons for that is an LLC becomes very flexible. We'll talk about this more tomorrow when it comes to tax structure. A corporation defaults to what's called a C corporation. Again, that's a tax structure. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. But corporations generally at the state level have more stringent reporting requirements than LLCs do. So for example, we said LLCs have members. Corporations are going to have shareholders. And when you have a corporation with shareholders, the shareholders are responsible for making the decisions, usually on an annual basis. The biggest decision shareholders of a corporation have to make is electing a board of directors. And then that board of directors needs to meet and make decisions for the company, the biggest one of which is hiring the executive leadership of the business. So how do you know this is actually happening inside your corporation? How do stockholders know that the corporation is being run the way they, as owners of the business, want it to be run? Well, there are annual and sometimes even quarterly filing requirements for corporations depending on the state. So at least annually, and some states it's more often, but at least annually, the business needs to file minutes from board of directors meetings, minutes from stockholders meetings. And so on top of just the annual renewal of the business license and on top of paying taxes for the business, there's usually also this additional requirement of filing board of directors and stockholders meeting minutes on top of all that. And so this makes corporations administratively a little bit more burdensome than just LLCs. LLCs tend to not have those additional reporting requirements. Plus, as far as the tax structures go, everything that you would do with a corporation in terms of tax structure, you can also do with an LLC. So there's really not a whole lot of advantage 9 times out of 10 in registering a corporation as opposed to an LLC. In fact, I'm usually going to default unless there's some really pressing reason with my clients. And this would be true of most accountants I know, business attorneys. Unless there's a really compelling reason to register a corporation, most of the time we're going to advise an LLC. And this just tends to be the easiest, most flexible, most dominant form of legal entity out there. And if you just notice the business names that you come across, most of them tend to have LLC after them. So why would you want to register this entity? What's the point here? One of the most common reasons is what is called legal liability, right? And so it's inherent within the name, especially of an LLC, the limited liability company. Well, what does that mean? I'm not a business attorney, right? And this starts to get into the legal aspects of what's going on here. And again, this is why I start off saying this is the legal entity. Tomorrow we're going to talk about tax issues and financial issues, but today we're talking legal entities. And get professional advice on which legal entity makes most sense for you from a business attorney if you have any legal questions about these things. But you need to register a business in a state in which that business is going to operate if you want that limited liability protection. What does this mean? In general, something happens, the business is at fault. A judge or a jury is going to find the business at fault. It provides some separation between the business's assets and your assets, namely, and most importantly, bank accounts. But there are all kinds of ways that won't hold up. In fact, it's probably a lot easier for that not to hold up than it is to maintain that. And again, this is why you need to have, if you're particularly in a business, in an industry where there's a higher likelihood, a higher risk of some sort of personal fault that the business is getting itself into, you really need to talk with the business attorney about how to structure the legal entity to make sure that these kinds of issues are prevented. But by creating this separate legal entity, you put a little bit of a gap between the entity itself, the business, and your own personal, especially financial life. So where do you need to actually register this thing if you're going to register it? It used to be the case that you needed to register a business where it had what's called physical presence. We determined physical presence a couple different ways. One, as the name implies, if the business was physically present in that state, if there was a brick and mortar location for that business, or if the headquarters was registered in that state, was located in that state. Physical presence has expanded, though, a little bit given modern technology because, one, we have a lot of businesses that operate that don't have physical locations. And two, we have businesses that might have physical locations, but they might have operations in states where they don't have, for example, a storefront. So, for example, remote workers. If you have remote employees in a different state from where your physical location is, right, then in general, you have physical presence in that state. One of the key indicators of physical presence, aside from just an actual street address with a building there, is where you have work being done. And if you have employees in a state, you have work being done in that state. Now, for self-employed people, this means wherever you're doing the work, you need to register that business. Now, this is where the work is happening, not where the work is coming from. So you can have clients spread out all over the place. Right? You can be accepting jobs from people all over the place. That doesn't matter. What matters is where the work is getting done. So if you predominantly work from your home and your home address is in Florida, then you need to have your business registered in Florida. If you have one or two big clients and they're all in Idaho, but you're doing the work in Florida, you need to register in Florida. You don't need to register in Idaho for the most part. Again, there might be some weird technical reasons here, but for the most part, and again, I'm not a business attorney, so this is not legal advice, and your case might be different, but that's true in general. So where do you have a physical presence? Now, we've had a little bit of a change to this because of a Supreme Court case a few years ago, U.S. Supreme Court case called Wayfair. The Wayfair decision established another level of what we call Nexus. Nexus is a fancy term that essentially means locations of a business where there needs to be some actual either registration of the entity or some sort of financial reporting of what's happening. And so we have this we start off with physical presence, right? Is there a location there, a physical location, or is there work being done in that area, right? Now we have this added layer, this added layer of Nexus called economic nexus. If your business does a lot of sales, if it has a substantial amount of payroll, or if it's making a lot of its profits out of a certain state, even if it doesn't have physical presence in that state, then it might still have some filing requirements. Therefore, it might still need to register in that state. Now, some other considerations. Some professions require a specific type of entity, registered entity, that isn't one of the three we've already discussed. So LLC, partnership, or corporation. Some professions, especially professional industries like doctors, attorneys, accountants, sometimes, depending on the state, might need a specific type of entity. So for example, there are professional associations, PA. Sometimes you'll see a business with the name, with the letters PA after it, or PLLC, Professional Limited Liability Company. PC, Professional Corporation. Again, this is very specific to certain industries. So if you're not in one of these professional service industries, then in general, you don't have to worry about it. You can also register what's called a DBA, or doing business as. Now, what a DBA does is it essentially gives you the right to that name as it's registered with your state. But it doesn't do anything more than that. So a DBA is not an LLC. A DBA is not any of the other legal entity types that we talked about. In fact, it's not a legal entity at all. It's literally just giving yourself the right to use that name in that state, the exclusive right to use that name in that state. But it doesn't give you anything in terms of the limited liability that the other entity types do. And it also, because it's not a legal entity, is not eligible for any of the kinds of tax structures that we're going to talk about tomorrow. So why would you want to use a DBA? Some people use a DBA just to register the name when they don't, for some reason, want to register the entire business. Another reason might be that they already have a business registered under one name, but they want to literally do business as another name. So if you've ever walked into the convenience store part of a gas station and you notice next to the door, they usually have it on in that sticker lettering next to the door that it's a certain business name, DBA, whatever you actually know the service station as. Right? And so this is a pretty typical case where there is some registered corporate name for that business, but nobody would recognize that name. But given that DBA, you can present a more recognizable name. I see a few of you coming back from the first half. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to shut that down. Not sure what happened. Guess I lost a connection, but thanks for coming back in. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to add those. Do you need an entity to do business? Do you need a legal entity? No, you don't need one. It's not necessary. You can run a business without a legal entity. And in fact, for some people, even some clients, I actually recommend not rushing to register an entity. Why? Because it can cost some money. And if you haven't actually started your business yet, if you haven't actually been operating, if you've never made a sale of your product or service yet, well, I want you to prove the concept first. Not necessarily to the market, but to yourself. I want to know that you're serious about what it is that you're selling or what it is that you're doing. And so before we go through the paperwork of filing to register an entity and then getting all the other paperwork done to maintain that entity, and now you're out the registration fees, which are usually a few $100. It can be a little bit more than that. California, for example, it's $70 to register, plus you have to pay the first $800 franchise tax up front. So in California, it's $870 to register a business. I want you to avoid those costs if you're not certain yet. Now, as soon as you're certain, right, yes, by all means, get the entity registered, lock in that name, get that limited liability, and let's start doing some tax planning as far as the tax treatment for this thing. Again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But you don't need an entity to get started. You can run a business under your own social security number. You can run a business under your own name. If you want to register the entity, though, do it, like I say, like I recommend, after you've already proven the concept to yourself. There's another case in which you might want to hold off on registering an entity, and that is that some industries, it's the standard to not deal with entities, but rather with individuals, even if those individuals are treated as contractors. So for example, in the insurance industry, this is fairly common, where insurance home offices won't deal with entities. They want to treat their contractors as individuals, not as entities. And so it gets a little more dicey for them to create an entity. The home office won't actually deal with that. And then they lose out on the tax benefits of having created that entity in the first place, and they wind up wasting a lot of time. Which is unfortunate. You know, this is to me, this seems like a weird policy that these home offices have, but some of them do for whatever reason. You know, I'm not in the insurance industry. I never have been. I don't understand why. I'm sure there's some reasoning there, but to me, it seems a little weird. But know what your client, and when you're self-employed, they're your client, not your boss, but know what your client is going to do in terms of whether you can have a registered entity or not, and them still pay you. So when do you need an entity? And this is the last part, unless there are some questions here. But when do you need an entity? Again, my recommendation is talk to a business attorney, talk to an accountant, because the entity does two things for you. One, it gives you that legal protection, that little bit of limited liability in legal terms between your business and personal finances and assets. The second thing is it allows for more complex tax treatments. We'll talk about tomorrow about how the LLC, this dominant entity type, it doesn't change anything as far as taxes goes. Registering an LLC doesn't change the tax treatment of your business, right? So initially what the LLC does is it gives you that limited liability. But the second important thing from my perspective as an accountant that it does is it allows you some more complex tax treatments that can wind up saving you taxes. And that's what we're going to get into tomorrow, is more on the tax treatments of these different entities and businesses, and why the LLC, part of why the LLC has become so dominant. So to those of you that joined in and watched this, thank you very much. These recordings will be posted. Unfortunately, there are going to be two, but they'll be posted. If you have questions, feel free to add those. If you have questions after I sign off, be sure to put those in the comments there, and I'll get to them that way too. If you have more questions just in general about starting and running a business, please let me know. You can do that either commenting on these videos or by DMing me. I'm happy to address those questions. Otherwise, I don't see any questions here, but thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.